Hello, friends. Oh, my hair. Okay, so, hi, welcome for joining, and, because V has to leave soon, I want to get right into the book. I don't exactly remember where we were, but we're just gonna get started. Wow, you can barely see my hair there because the darkness and the color and... Hello, lady. Okay. Let me know if the music is too loud or too soft, and I will adjust accordingly. We are reading Nancy Drew, number 12, The Message in the Hollow Oak. We're gonna jump right in. V, thank you for being here as long as you have. I'm gonna read as much as I can before you leave. Feel free to do whatever you need to do. Page sip emoji, right? I forgot everything that has happened. Exactly. I'll remember as we get back into it. Man, my hair just... the way it's cut with my bangs and everything just reminds me of being in 7th grade, and I'm just not sure. I mean, I like the color, but maybe I don't like my bangs like this, because I just feel like it's too 7th grade. I remember I was taking bets about if that lady was going to die. Nancy is being a Nancy while also Nancying. This is true. Are we not still in 7th grade? No, Terry, we're not. It's been quite a while since then. Been like 12 years. Is that right? Probably longer than that. But anyways, yeah, longer than that. 13 years? Yeah, 13 years. That's right. Okay, even longer for me. Yeah, because you're 40. How old are you now? Like 48? Okay, we're on chapter 8. A ruse. There was no response. Niles knocked again at the door. I thought he wouldn't be here, Norman Ranney said. He watched the two men closely, and they could not help but see the suspicious look in his eyes. Exasperated, Stripe flung open the door that had been left unlocked. Look here, Norman Ranney protested, following them inside. You can't break into a man's house like this. Oh, can't we? Stripe sneered. Wheeling about, he leaped upon the surprised man and dropped him to the floor. Niles aided in holding the victim down until his arms and legs could be tied. Put a gag in his mouth, too, Stripe advised, or he'll be letting out a yell at the wrong time. Okay, drive safe. His companion found an old towel, which he stuffed between the prospector's teeth. I guess that'll keep him safe for a while, he observed in relief. No telling what he might have done to us if he'd had the chance. Trap may come back any minute, Stripe commented uneasily. We'll have to hide this fellow somewhere. Niles was peering into the dark basement. I think there's some kind of closet or fruit cellar down there, he said. The two men carried the helpless prospector below and locked him in the little stuffy room which Niles had discovered. Carefully, they closed the entrance to the dungeon-like place and returned to the upper floor. Scarcely had they recovered their breaths than Niles, who was standing by the window, observed Nancy Drew and her party beaching their canoe on the lakeshore. We're just in time, Tom. What's our next move? We'll hide and let them walk into our trap. No sooner had the two secreted themselves than a knock was heard upon the door. This was repeated several times. Niles and Stripe waited breathlessly, expecting that Nancy and her friends would soon give up and force their way in, but the little party did not choose to intrude upon private property. Instead, Nancy gazed speculatively toward the old mill, which stood at some distance from the house. Mr. Trapp may be working there, she suggested. Shall we investigate? Not until she and her companions had reached the dilapidated old building did they see that it had not been used in recent years. The stream that fed the water wheel had entirely dried away. It isn't likely Mr. Trapp is here, George commented. After walking this far, we may as well make sure, Nancy said. She led the way toward the structure. Bess and George, attracted by the water wheel, stopped to look at it, and Nancy, going on, presently lost sight of the guide also. She wandered alone through the machinery room and examined the granary. Impelled by some impulse which she could not explain, she walked over to the decaying wall. Stooping over, she peered through one of the large cracks, through which she could see the inside of the cabin quite plainly. Tom Stripe was standing at the window, cautiously peering out. Nancy could hardly believe her eyes. However, a second glance assured her that she had not been mistaken. Stripe and Niles had arrived ahead of her at the shack. For all she knew, they might have harmed Grandfather Pierre. I don't remember any of this. Does any of this sound familiar to you guys? Hastily, she returned to her friends and in terse sentences reported to them what she had seen. "They hope to take us by surprise," she said. "We must outwit them." "But how?" George demanded. In a few words, Nancy outlined a plan. Bess and George were to circle to the rear of the cabin, being careful not to be seen. From the trees, they were to watch Stripe and his companion. "Pete and I will sneak back and hide the canoe." "But I don't see what good that will do," Bess protested. "Perhaps it will do no good, but I'm hoping that Niles and Stripe will notice that the craft is gone and come to the conclusion that we left with it." "That's an idea," George chuckled. "Come on, Bess. Better take off that bright hat of yours. It's too conspicuous." Keeping themselves well hidden by the brush, Nancy and the guide stole down to the shore where they had beached the canoe. They directed a hasty glance toward the cabin to make sure their movements had not been observed, and then drew the boat far back into the brush. At the girls' instigation, Pete thereupon obliterated the tracks leading to the hiding place, a precaution which Nancy did not forget to take. The pair then moved on down the beach, making a wide circle back to the rear of the old home. For a long time nothing happened, and Nancy felt herself growing discouraged. "I guess it's of no use," she said in disgust. "Wait," the guide directed, pulling her back into the bushes. The door of the cabin slowly opened, and Raymond Niles peered cautiously forth. He motioned to Stripe, and the two made their way stealthily down to the waterfront. "Why, they've gone!" the former exclaimed, observing the place where the canoe had been beached. "That's queer," his companion muttered, looking about him. "I didn't see them leave." "I lost sight of them when they went into the old mill," Niles added. "Wonder where they could have gone." "Not back to Wellington Lake, that's certain. Nancy Drew wouldn't give up so easily." "You're right," Niles agreed. "Say, I'll bet that guide of hers knows where to find Chap. Likely as not he's gone to inspect Nancy Drew's new property. It adjoins his land, and he may have decided to buy it." "Say, why didn't we think of that before?" Niles demanded. "I wondered why she was streaking way off here. Must be she has some arrangement with Chap about buying the land." "That's why she wouldn't deal with us," Stripe growled. The two men peered out over the lake, but there was no sign of the little red canoe. If we only had a boat, we might overtake them," Stripe muttered. "I know the location of the land." They glanced up and down the shore. As chance would have it, Pierre Chap had left his boat beached upon the sand, only 100 yards away. With one accord, the two men ran toward it. "They'll get good and tired before they've rowed that tub very far," the girl's guide chuckled as he saw the men launch the craft. "It weighs a ton, and Pierre Chap never uses it anymore." After the boat was far out upon the lake, Nancy and Pete joined George and Bess, who had witnessed everything from the rear of the cabin. They had climbed tall trees, and from their lookout had been able to see and hear clearly all that was going on. "Pierre Chap should be coming here soon," should be coming home soon, Nancy said thoughtfully, as the party considered its next move. "Maybe we ought to go inside the cabin and see how things are." "I'll stay outdoors and keep watch," Pete offered, opening the door for the girls to enter. "Stripe and his friend may decide to come back. It's better to have someone remain on guard." Nancy and her chums settled themselves comfortably inside the homestead, being careful all the while to disturb nothing. Everything was in order, only the breakfast dishes had not been washed. "At least we know that Mr. Chap has been here today," Nancy commented, "so it's quite likely that he'll return before dark." After some time, the girls grew tired of sitting around idle, so Bess suggested that they wash and dry the dishes. "We may as well," George agreed. "It will help Mr. Chap, and at the same time keep us from dying of boredom." Bess heated some water on the little oil stove and soon had some clean dishes for her chums to dry. Nancy was putting them away in the cupboard when she abruptly halted and listened intently. "What's wrong?" George asked uneasily. Nancy did not answer immediately. "Guess it was nothing," she finally responded. She did not want to disturb her chums, yet was positive that she had heard a queer noise coming from the cellar. "You must be imagining things," Bess laughed. "There is something about this place that gets on one's nerves. It must be the silence." "I didn't hear a thing," George added. "It must have been—" Her words ended in a surprised gasp, for a low groan seemed to issue from the very floorboards. "Did you hear that?" She whispered apprehensively. "What could it have been?" Bess shuddered. "It sounded like someone in pain," Nancy replied. They huddled together, listening intently. A moment later, they heard the strange noise again, a loud, unearthly moan. "It's a ghost," Bess insisted, her teeth chattering with fright. "There are no ghosts," Nancy returned firmly, but it took all her courage to add, "I'm going down to the cellar and find out just what it really is." Okay, end of chapter 8. I'm trying to see what happened in the chapter before this. It sounds like they were in a canoe and they saw the bad guys and they toppled the canoe. And then it went to the bad guys to show what they were doing, which I feel like they don't usually do that. I don't know. Did we read the last chapter? Chapter 7? I don't remember it at all. I honestly don't know. I don't know where we were in the book. I don't remember the last chapter. I don't know. Well, Brutro, I hunger. Do you need to go get some food? Yeah, everybody has a type. I feel like I would remember an attractive water wheel. Stealth section. I'm terrible at stealth sections. Aren't we all? I'm tempted to look back to see if we read chapter 7, but I may just do that, if you don't mind. Okay, the last read stream was January 25th. Watch. Bushes. Who are you? Strike demanded. Granny is the name, the man informed him. Norman Randy. Annette Chap? The words seared his very brain. Okay. What's the matter? Niles asked suddenly. You look sick. Randy stared at him on the stoop. Where did you get this paper? He questioned. Oh, from a girl. We did read chapter 7. I just don't remember it at all. Okay. Well, we figured it out. Terror aged 4 years in less than 1. Welcome for joining, Heartless. Yeah, apparently so. He's fancy like that. Okay. We'll get back to it now. So, I'll just try to remember what happened. Maybe it'll come back to me. Chapter 9, The Cellar Ghost. Bess and George tried to dissuade Nancy from descending into the dark basement. You don't know what might be down there, Bess whispered tensely. So why risk your life? I'll be all right, Nancy maintained. If anything should happen, just step to the door and call Pete. Let's get him now, George urged. No, we need him out there to keep guard. I'm going to investigate this place myself. Courageously, Nancy lifted the trap door and peered down into the dark cellar. Despite her air of confidence, she did not enjoy the task she had assigned to herself. If only I had a light. She murmured the phrase as she slowly descended into the dark void. Bess and George, waiting fearfully at the top of the stairs, heard the words blur off. Their chum had vanished. Suddenly, there came a slight commotion from below. Bess and George huddled against the wall, fearing the worst. Before they had recovered from their fear, Nancy emerged, clutching a gray cat. Her young chums were so relieved when they saw what the trouble had been that they burst into laughter. Behold the ghost! Nancy smiled. A cat! George exclaimed contemptuously. She bent down to stroke the animal. Nice tabby, nice tabby. Tell me, how did you learn to make such unearthly sounds? Nancy closed the trapdoor. The animal seemed to be entirely satisfied with the new quarters. Ignoring the girls, the little creature went over to a warm corner, curled up, and was soon dozing. It's hard to believe that one small cat could cause so much excitement, Nancy smiled. I'm glad we didn't call Pete, for he would have laughed at us. Again, the girls settled themselves to await the return of Pierre's shop. The clock on the mantel struck 5, and simultaneously with the last note, a loud moan issued from the cellar. Nancy and her chums jumped up from their chairs. That wasn't the cat, George whispered. Bess gripped Nancy's arm, trembling with fright. I'll find out what it is, the Drew girl said, determinedly. Before she could move, there was a loud crash that seemed to come from under their very feet. Oh, ho! Bess wailed and toppled over in a faint. Nancy rushed to the door. Pete! Pete! She called. There was no response to her cry. The guide had vanished. She darted back into the house and helped George carry Bess out into the open air. There the girl quickly revived, although her face remained pale. Let's take the canoe and get away from here as soon as possible, she pleaded. We can't leave without Pete, Nancy told her. The guide's strange disappearance troubled and annoyed her. Surely the man had not abandoned them deliberately. Nancy glanced toward the horizon. The sun was still fairly high, but the woods were dark and gloomy. The thought of remaining at the Chap cabin after dark with no older person present caused even her courageous heart to quail. For an instant, she was tempted to heed Bess's suggestion, but put the thought from her mind. Even if they should start for Wellington Lake without delay, they could not hope to reach that place before dark. Without Pete to guide them, they would be hopelessly lost. Nancy stared grimly at the homestead. It challenged her. George read the thought which ran through her friend's mind. "Nancy Drew, don't you dare to think of going back into that dreadful place." "Listen," Bess commanded. The groaning had started again. Resolutely, Nancy walked into the house. With the greatest of reluctance, George and Bess followed her, pleading with her not to attempt anything reckless. "Wait for me at the head of the stairs," Nancy directed. "I'm going to make a thorough investigation." Cautiously, she descended the steps one at a time. It was so dark she could scarcely see a foot ahead of her. She groped her way along the wall, listening intently all the while. Suddenly, she stepped on something long and snake-like. There was a startled meow as the girl stumbled over the object that lay in her path. She then pitched headlong upon the damp floor. "Nancy! Nancy!" Bess screamed in terror from above. "I'm all right," their chum called, getting to her feet a trifle shakily. "I only stumbled over another cat." "Do be careful," George warned her friend anxiously. Nancy scarcely heard what they said, for she was listening intently to what she thought was the sound of soft breathing. Next, there came an almost inaudible moan, which seemed to issue from the direction of the fruit closet. Gathering her courage, the girl tried the door, but it would not open. Groping about in the musty darkness, she located the key in the lock and turned it. Opening the door a crack, she peered inside. At first she saw nothing, then gradually she could make out the figure of a man lying on the floor. "Girls!" she shouted excitedly. "Come here! I think poor Mr. Chap has been hurt." Bess and George dashed down the stairs to help her. They stared aghast as they beheld the bearded man lying trussed and gagged on the cold, hard floor. "Get a knife."
I found something on the web about they stare as fast as they can help with bearded men playing truss to get on the cold, hard floor. Check it out.
What? Siri? I never said her name. I don't understand. That was weird. Okay, get a knife to cut his mons, Nancy urged. George ran back to the kitchen for the article, while Nancy and Bess removed the gag from the man's mouth. "We'll soon have you free," they encouraged the fellow. George came with the knife, and the thongs were quickly severed. "Can you walk?" Nancy questioned him anxiously, as they helped the fellow to his feet. "I think so," he responded with an effort. Supporting him on either side, the girls assisted him up the stairs and into the kitchen. As the circulation improved in his numb limbs, he was able to walk more freely. "Water," he pleaded. Bess ran to get it. After the man had drunk deeply, he smiled gratefully at the girls. "I feel better now," he said, relieved. Nancy studied his face intently. "You can't be Pierre Chap," she declared, "for you are far too young." "I live some distance from here," the bearded prospector told her. "Two men stopped me on the trail and asked me the way to this place. I grew suspicious and decided to come with them. They overpowered me and threw me into the cellar. If it hadn't been for your timely arrival, I might have lain there and died." "It must have been Tom Stripe and Raymond Niles who did it," Nancy surmised. "Can you describe your assailants?" The prospector gave an accurate description of the two men. "They ought to be arrested for such an outrage," George cried indignantly. "When we return to Lake Wellington, we'll report the matter to the police." The prospector looked troubled. "I'd rather you wouldn't," he said. "I couldn't appear in court against them. I'd prefer to even score myself." During the conversation, Nancy had remained strangely quiet, though her chums noted that she stared at the stranger in a most peculiar manner. In truth, the Drew girl was bewildered. From the first, the man had reminded her of someone, and vainly did she rack her memory. Where had she seen him before? Suddenly the answer came to her. Save for the beard, the stranger put her in mind of a photograph she had in her possession. Trying not to show her excitement, she turned to the prospector and asked him eagerly, "Can it be possible that you are Norman Ranney?" Okay, end of chapter 9. I was 45 and then my birthday happened and I was 46. Big 47 this year. I beat Dad of War last night. Fruit coma, it'll happen. I'll get back to that now that my schedule is finally going back to normal. Welcome for clapping. Okay, well. I suppose we shall continue. I'm not sure how long I'm going to go today. Oh wow, since this is the original edition, this book is a lot longer. It's 218 pages instead of, like the 185 or whatever it is the other ones are. Hey Joni, welcome for joining, nice to see you. I'm back for a few minutes till I have to clock in. Oh, okay. Well, glad you arrived safely. I can't remember what happened last time, so I'm just kind of along for the ride now. Which is, I feel like, what usually happens by the time I get to this point in my reading. How is everybody? Just a random announcement. So I've been working on adding some new features to the stream. So as you guys know, the currency system in my streams... Yeah, Siri tried to take over. The currency system is pirouettes, since my channel is kind of tied to ballet. And if you type !pirouettes, like, thank you Terry, you will see how many pirouettes you have and what rank you're at. So Terry is a soloist, which is one away from principal, which is the highest rank you can get, but I think the principal mark is at 10,000 pirouettes, I think. I can't remember exactly. That may be right. So, whoa, caps! So, Heartless and V are core phase. In the chorus. Yeah, but you're a soloist of the core. So, you get featured. You're not just a core member. You're a special core member. But anyways, if you do !redeem, you will see rewards that you can unlock by spending some of your pirouettes. And I've worked on that, and if you guys have any suggestions for more rewards, or different rewards, you can always let me know, and I will take them into consideration, because the ones that I have are just kind of the ones I thought of while I was working on it, so, oh! It's, redeem. !redeem. Yeah. So, I don't know if any of those are of interest to you guys, but... Getting a phone call, but I don't know them, so... So if you hear that, I'm sorry. Yeah, you can probably hear it. But I'm not answering. I realized when I did the unlock, I need to fix that because the noise actually sounds like it's locking. So, I need to fix that. But yeah, if you guys have any suggestions, I'm open to suggestions for different rewards. But yeah, and obviously the way you redeem them is if you type the command that I have listed, so Just like you would at V's channel, basically. V knows full well my stinginess in spending currency. Just play it in reverse. Just play it in reverse. What? Terror likes to hoard his currency like Smaug. Smaug. Yeah. Just play it in reverse. Oh, the sound effect. Yeah. The unlock noise. Yeah, I figured it out. We also have exclamation point sound effects, which if you do redeem... How many pirouettes do you have to redeem? 5,000 pirouettes, you can create a channel sound effect. I don't know if I can reverse it. I can look for a different one, though. It's not like it's that hard to add. I just lay on top of the tickets and hope no cursed hobbits try to take it all from me. Just making sure I don't get a voicemail. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about that. I worked all day on some of the stuff, so I do have, I think V already played one of my sound effects, but I do have a sound effect for me. It's kind of long. I don't know how loud it is also. So yeah, that's the angsty one. You gotta go clock in. Have a great rest of the stream. Well, thank you for being here, V. I hope you have a good rest of your day and a good weekend. And also, I may be streaming tonight, so maybe I'll see you then. But yeah, thank you, Terry. And yes, I need to fix the unlock sound effect. What else did I do? I do want to do custom sound effects for my stream alerts. Just looking at my hair, I feel like you can really tell the length difference today. I don't know why that's any different than another day, but whatever. Maybe it's because my hair's... I have it... not pulled back, but... yeah, I don't know. Of course, gotta see something family related. Hope I can return. If I cannot, I apologize and hope the stream goes great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Terry. Thank you for being here. Good luck with your family-related thing, and if I don't see you later, maybe I'll see you tonight. And I'll go ahead and keep reading. So, we're on chapter 10, The Guide Disappears. The stranger stared at Nancy in astonishment. For an instant, she thought he intended to deny his identity, but he reluctantly nodded his head in assent. Yes, I'm Norman Ranney. How did you know? Your mother lent me your photograph, Nancy explained. I also met Anne Chappelle, who told me her right name was Annette Chapp. The color drained from the man's face at mention of his former sweetheart. You have seen Annette? He demanded, gripping Nancy's arm so tightly that it hurt her. Then she's still alive? Yeah. When I last heard from the hospital, she was slowly improving. She was seriously injured in a train wreck. Oh yeah. A while back, and for some time the doctors feared she could not live. Even now, she is not entirely out of danger. My poor Annette, if only I might go to her. Can't you? Nancy asked quietly. I'm afraid she would not care to see me. I firmly believe she still loves you, Nancy assured him. Norman Ranney hung upon the girl's words, though he shook his head sadly. I should like to think so, but unfortunately I am unable to. Why do you say that? Nancy inquired, puzzled at his attitude. Sorry, my hair is driving me nuts. Surely it cannot be that you've changed in your feelings toward Miss Chapp. A trifle uneasily, she recalled the story the authoress had told her concerning the message in the hollow oak. If it were true that Norman Ranney had ignored the note, it was possible that even now he desired to avoid the entangling fetters of matrimony. I haven't changed in my regard for Annette, the man told her sincerely. I have always loved her, and I always will. Then why can't you go to her now? You don't understand. I have nothing to offer her. I'm only a prospector. Why, people in this community do not even know my real name. I thought it best to change it after I returned from the war. You've lived here ever since? Nancy inquired. No, I visit my parents occasionally and have stayed in many states and countries. There's something about this community that always draws me back. I guess it's because I knew Annette here. Nancy nodded understandingly. Then the man went on, speaking brusquely to hide his emotions. When I was discharged from the army, I was told that Annette had died. Until today, I had no suspicion that she might still be alive. Tell me, do you ever visit the old hollow oak? Nancy asked significantly. Yes, quite often. I was almost killed there 2 nights ago during a terrific windstorm. While I was sitting under the tree, a large bough snapped off. Then you were the stranger mentioned in the newspaper, Nancy commented. Yes, here's the proof of it, the man smiled, pushing back his hair to reveal a deep gash in his scalp. It was a wonder I wasn't killed. Not that it would have mattered greatly. Oh, you mustn't talk that way, Nancy said hastily. I can't help feeling the way I do. Life has never been worthwhile since I lost Annette. But wasn't it your own fault? Nancy inquired gently. Wow, way to go, Nancy. My own fault? What do you mean? Didn't you ignore the message she left for you in the oak tree? Norman Ranney laughed shortly. I've been trying to forget it all my life. But why did you never meet her as she requested? Nancy asked, a trifle exasperated. Meet her? The note said nothing about that. Didn't it state the town just over the border where she expected to join you? It most certainly did not. Annette wrote me a very cold note. I recall the words. She said, I will not elope. I would rather have my grandfather's money. That isn't the way she explained it to me, Nancy gasped. It must all have been a hoax. Perhaps someone changed the messages. She then recounted everything Miss Chappelle had told her in the hospital, noting all the while that Norman Ranney was deeply moved by the story. I can't understand it, he murmured after she had finished. If I thought she was still waiting for me, I'd go to her at once. I'm sure she is, Nancy told him. She wrote the note nearly 19 years ago, and I know we have both changed greatly since that time. You tell me that Annette is now a successful novelist, but I have so little to offer her. Nancy tried to persuade him that he was sufficient unto himself. Though he listened closely to her words, they seemed to make no definite impression upon him. Had I known about the exchange of notes before I went to war, everything might have been different now, he said sadly. Annette has her place in the city, and I have my work here in the woods. But if you knew that she needed you, Nancy persisted, I'd drop everything and go to her. After a moment's silence, Nancy questioned, Do you often see Grandfather Chapp? Yes, though he does not know who I am. He became a recluse after his daughter ran away. He always ruled Annette with an iron hand, though he loved her dearly. Now he shuts himself up in his cabin with only his pet cats to keep him company. He's a cat man. I've already met 2 of them, Nancy smiled, ruefully surveying a bruised elbow. Have you any idea when Mr. Chapp will return? Not the slightest. It begins to look as if he doesn't intend to come back here tonight. Nancy and her chums looked troubled. We don't know what to do, George confessed. Our guide has disappeared. We're stranded here in the woods. Who is your guide? Pete Atkins. That's queer. He's as reliable a man as you'll find in these parts. We don't know what to make of it, Nancy admitted. We brought along camping equipment, but it's very meager. The nights are pretty cold here, Norman Ranny warned. If Mr. Chapper, your guide, should not return soon, I could take you to the nearest town where you might find more comfortable quarters. The girls thanked him and sat down to wait. The sun dropped lower in the sky. Long shadows soon fell upon the lake. In a short while it would be dusk. I doubt if it will do us any good to stay here much longer, Ranny suggested. I suppose we should be starting out, Nancy said. After leaving a note for the guide in the event of his returning, Nancy and her chums followed the prospector a short distance through the dense timber until they arrived at a swiftly moving stream. From among the overhanging bushes, the man drew forth a sturdy boat. This will be the quickest route, he stated, as he assisted the girls into the craft. Nancy was reluctant to leave the vicinity, for she had not had a chance either to talk to Pierre Chap or to inspect her newly acquired property. As they rowed down the stream, skillfully avoiding rocks and boulders, she drew the prospector into conversation concerning the mineral value of neighboring land. When Norman Ranny replied to her questions and displayed an interest in her affairs, she gave him a description of the tract she owned. It's not far from here, the prospector told her, though it is an even wilder section than this. Too bad you couldn't have inspected it. That's what I really wanted to do, Nancy admitted. It's disappointing to have to leave without having seen it. Randy rested on his oars as he debated the situation. Well, why not turn around and go back? He proposed. I know a trapper and his wife with whom you might perhaps spend the night. In the morning you could continue onto your own property. Let's do it, George declared enthusiastically. Yeah, let's go spend the night with random strangers. After all, we made the trip to Canada partly in a spirit of adventure. Mrs. Donnelly won't worry about us if we don't get back to Wellington Lake for several days, Bess added. She won't? Why not? Nancy required no urging to decide in favor of the trip, and gratefully accepted the prospector's generous offer to take them to the Dawson cabin. Norman Ranny directed the boat into a side stream, which was even swifter than the one they had previously taken. It required all his skill to keep them from being dashed against the rocks. Now and then a low-hanging bush would swish against the girl's cheeks, cutting like a whip. I can hardly wait until I see the land, Nancy declared excitedly. How thrilled I'd be if there were gold on it. That is the sustaining hope of every prospector, Randy smiled. But this property of yours sounds mighty good to me. I found several big nuggets in Pebble Creek, which flows through your place. I'd love to see a nugget, Bess remarked. Resting on his oars for a moment, Randy took a small leather bag from his pocket and offered it to her. Somewhat odd, Bess withdrew several small lumps of gold, balancing them in the palm of her hand. I thought they would glitter more than this, she said. Randy laughed. They may not look like gold to you now, he said, but they are, just the same. After each of the girls had finished examining the specimens, Bess returned the bag to the prospector. I hope we'll find a few nuggets on my property, Nancy said wistfully. I'd like to take them home with me as souvenirs. I'll help you pan the stream if we have time, Randy offered. It was quite dark when the man finally guided the boat into a cove and moored it. Through the trees, the girls could see a light burning in a cabin. Randy led the way, and in response to his knock, a woman came to the door. She greeted him warmly, calling him by a name that was unfamiliar to Nancy and her chums. Come right in, she said when she saw the girls. We don't have many visitors, and we're always glad to entertain them. The evening meal was cooking on a stove. The delightful aroma nearly overpowered Nancy and her chums, for they were weak from hunger. Sit in, Mr. Dawson, the trapper, invited cordially, drawing up chairs for the girls. The food's plain, but there's plenty of it. Again, the three chums were ashamed of their hearty appetites, though Mr. and Mrs. Dawson insisted that they were not doing full justice to the various dishes offered them. When Nancy tactfully suggested that she intended to pay for all the trouble she and her friends were causing, the couple refused to listen. Don't you give it a second thought, their hostess chuckled. It's a treat for us to have you here. In truth, the kindly people seemed to be enjoying the company of the girls, and plied them with innumerable questions about city life. After the supper dishes had been washed, the trapper brought out his banjo and played several gay, old-fashioned tunes. Our son should be coming in before long, Mrs. Dawson told Nancy. Herman went to the nearest settlement for our monthly order of groceries. Jake, the older boy, started out to do some trout fishing. As she spoke, the woman crossed over to the window to peer out. It troubled her that her boys had not yet returned. "I can't understand what's keeping Jake," she remarked a little later. "It's too dark for him to be fishing now." 10 minutes later, footsteps could be heard outside. The door was flung open, and a youth, clad in the rough garments of a woodsman, staggered into the room, bending low under the weight of a man whom he carried on his back. "Jake!" Mrs. Dawson cried, rushing to him. "What has happened?" "I found him on the trail," he told his mother breathlessly, lowering the fellow to a couch. "He's badly hurt." Nancy glanced anxiously at the injured man. He was Pete Atkins. End of chapter 10. Asking Keegan a question, a very important question concerning frozen custard, because our local custard place is having one of their they're having like their opening day anniversary thing, and so they opened in 2001. So in honor of that, they're putting 2001 prices on the menu. So any excuse to go eat frozen custard, right? That's how I feel anyways. We'll just truck right along here. I don't know that we'll finish today, but I don't know. And I don't know if anybody else is planning on streaming this afternoon. I forgot to open Discord. I knew there was something I was forgetting. Yeah, okay. It announced me, so that's good. Alright. Alright, let's continue on. Chapter 11, A False Claim. The guide stirred restlessly upon the couch as Nancy bent over him. "Tom Stripe did it," he mumbled. "I'll get even." Mrs. Dawson ran for a basin of warm water with which to sponge a gash on the victim's neck. A large bump stood out upon the back of Pete's head, and Nancy suspected that the man had been struck from behind with a heavy club. "I don't believe he's as badly hurt as it appeared at first," Norman Ranney said, after they had worked over Pete for some time. "If he gets a good sleep, he should be all right in the morning." "If he isn't, I'll start for a doctor," Jake offered. Nancy and her friends were given a room for the night. Randy and Jake, who did not mind sleeping in the open, rolled up in blankets in the backyard. Okay. It was thought best not to move the guide from the couch, so Mr. Dawson spent the night watching by his bedside. In the morning, Pete was considerably improved, though in no condition to endure the hardships of the trail. When Nancy questioned him as to what had transpired, he offered but little information. "Tom Stripe and I have an old grudge. He got me this time, but wait until we meet again," was all he would say. Although Nancy disliked leaving Pete behind, she realized he could hope for no better care than at the hands of the kindly Mrs. Dawson. It seemed best that the girl go forward with her plans for viewing the newly acquired tract of land. Mr. Dawson furnished the party with excellent saddle horses, and his wife packed a lunch for the girls to take with them. "You'll be perfectly safe with your new guide," she assured Nancy, smiling in Norman Rainey's direction. There isn't a better woodsman in this part of the country than he. Leaving the Dawson cabin, the party rode single file along a steep, rocky trail. Often their course would lead them beside some winding stream, where they paused to permit their horses to drink. "Did you ever see such marvelous scenery before in all your life?" Bess demanded admiringly as they paused at the crest of a pine knoll to gaze back toward the Dawson cabin. "Aren't you the lucky girl, Nancy, to own property in such a gorgeous district as this?" "I'll not be very lucky if there isn't any gold here," Nancy laughed. "The land is so inaccessible for me it would be worthless for any other purpose." At noon, they halted near a waterfall for lunch, and after a brief rest, continued their climb. An hour later, Ranny, who was in the lead, drew up his mount and waited for the girls. With a sweep of his hand, he indicated a fairly level stretch of land. "Behold your property, Miss Drew." With a feeling akin to awe, Nancy permitted her gaze to sweep over the vast expanse of territory. "All that? Mine?" "Land is cheap this far north," Randy smiled. "But it won't be so for long, not if gold should be found here." "I feel like a feudal lord surveying his vast domain," Nancy smiled. "Father must have realized what an experience this would be when he sent me up here." Slowly the group descended the knoll and tied their horses to some trees near Pebble Creek. "But where is the gold?" Bess queried in disappointment as they walked about in the open stretches. "I haven't seen a single nugget." Norman Raney laughed heartily. "Did you expect to find them kicking around underfoot?" he asked. "Well, I didn't know where to look," Bess returned defensively. "If you wish, we'll pan the creek," Randy proposed. "I brought the necessary equipment." "I want the first nugget!" George cried gleefully. The girls watched eagerly from the bank as the prospector panned for gold. At first it was exciting, but after a time the novelty of it wore off and they grew slightly tired of it. "It doesn't look very promising," Bess commented wearily. Just then, Randy took out a small object and tossed it over to Nancy. "There's your nugget. It isn't worth much, but it's gold." After that, everyone wanted to try panning. The girls forgot all sense of time as they took turns using the man's equipment. Nancy found a similar lump of gold, while George, by diligent effort, acquired a slightly smaller one. "I'm the only person that didn't get one," Bess grieved. "Never mind, you may have the first one that was found," Nancy comforted. While the girls had been engrossed at the stream, Randy had wandered away to do a little prospecting on his own account. They came upon him working with his pick. "Miss Drew, you may have something here after all," he said quickly as Nancy paused beside him. "The gold in the creek doesn't amount to much, but it looks to me as if I have struck a vein. Should that be the case, your fortune will have been made." "I'll owe everything to you if I should strike gold," Nancy assured Randy gratefully. "I'm so ignorant about mining that I wouldn't know the difference between plain rock and gold ore." "If you like, I'll do some real prospecting here when I have more time," the man said. Before Nancy could thank him for his friendly offer, a monotonous drone was suddenly heard coming from above. She peered upward to glimpse an airplane slowly circling over a large open stretch of land. "Why, I believe it's going to come down!" she cried. Fearfully, they all watched as the plane slide-slipped earthward. A wing barely missed grazing the branch of a pine tree, which the pilot skillfully maneuvered to avoid. The craft struck the narrow plot and came bumping down over the rough ground. Before Nancy and her companions could reach the ship, 2 men leaped from the cockpit. "What are you doing on private property?" one of them demanded to Randy. "This land belongs to me," Nancy maintained. "Your claim is ridiculous," the other man snapped. "I am the owner of this ground. All of you must leave at once." Frightened, Bess and George backed away. Randy and Nancy stood still. "You are rank imposters," the prospector shouted angrily. "I've seen other men of your stamp before." He advanced menacingly, but Nancy placed a restraining hand upon his arm. "Mr. Randy, you may have made a mistake about this being my property," she said. "After all, the boundaries weren't surveyed." "I have made no mistake," the man retorted, his lips drawn in a thin, hard line. The 2 newcomers ignored the little party and began to stake out a claim. They selected the hillside where Randy had been digging. "I might have known what you were after," the prospector said in a threatening voice. "You're nothing but low-down thieves." A fight would doubtless have resulted had not another interruption come. An instant later, another airplane loomed overhead. Everyone turned to look at it as it slowly circled and presently landed beside the other ship. Several men sprang out and began to unload mining machinery and equipment from the cockpit. "There's no use in opposing them," Nancy warned Ranny. "They intend to steal my property. We can't prevent them, for they greatly outnumber us." She felt sick at heart as she realized how she had been tricked. Not for an instant did she doubt that Tom Stripe and Raymond Niles were back of the scheme to steal her valuable mining land. She understood now why they had endeavored to reach the property before she did. One of the men, whom the others addressed as Buck Sawtice, presently advanced toward the girls. His attitude was decidedly menacing. "We can't have you hanging around here," he said curtly. "You'll have to get off this claim. It belongs to the Yellow Dawn." "Is that a company or a disease?" George asked sarcastically. Sassy George, I like it. "It's a mining company, young lady. Now, if you don't want any trouble, get going." Nancy signaled her companions to offer no resistance. Taking their cue from her, they followed her across the field. However, the daughter of Carson Drew had no intention of abandoning the battle. She realized that it would be useless for her to enter into physical combat. If she wanted to defend her right, she would have to go to court. "I must prove indisputably my claim to the land," she reflected, thinking rapidly. "But I must also be quick about it, or it will be too late to save the gold." From the moment that Nancy had sighted the two airplanes, a daring plan had occurred to her. Glancing quickly over her shoulder to make sure that Sawtice and his companions did not see her, she crossed over to the nearest ship and addressed the pilot. "Did Mr. Sawtice hire you to bring him here?" "Yes, he did," the aviator returned crossly, "but he misrepresented the landing place and beat me down on the price." "Are you under contract to wait for him?" "No, but of course I expected he'd want me to take him back. Why did you want to know?" "Because I must get to Wellington Lake as soon as possible," Nancy replied. "These men are crooks and are trying to cheat me out of my property. I must get to the nearest telegraph station and wire my father. Will you take me and my chums?" The pilot debated but an instant. "Jump in and we'll be off," he cried, opening the door of the cabin. Nancy turned to bid Norman Rainey goodbye. To her surprise, he announced that he had intended to accompany her. "I've decided to go to Wyndham, Miss Drew. I've been thinking about it all day. Even if Annette has changed in her feelings toward me, I can't bear to leave her alone in a hospital." "I'm glad you've altered your original decision," Nancy said to him, her eyes shining. Then she and her companions found seats in the cabin of the plane. The pilot soon had the propeller turning. It was not until the roar and crack of the motor had rent the air that the men who had taken possession of the land realized what was happening. With a shout of anger, they ran toward the aircraft. The pilot turned his ship in a narrow space. Then, taxiing to the far end of the open stretch, he came roaring down the field. Buck Sawtice and his fellow conspirators were hopelessly outdistanced. However, the pilot was so intent upon avoiding them that he failed to observe another man who had darted from the bushes and was now running directly into the path of the oncoming plane. "Stop! Stop!" he shouted, waving his arms. Nancy nearly fainted at thought of the impending tragedy. Okay. This all seems kind of ridiculous, honestly. Not that some of the plot twists in the 60s versions were much better, but they're at least more realistic than two airplanes landing in the middle of a field with no runway and taking off again without Nancy having to, offer to pay the guy. She didn't even offer to pay the guy. She was just like, "These guys are crooks. Will you, take me instead?" Let me see what Keegan said. Okay, continuing on. Chapter 12. A Reunion. "It's Tom Stripe!" cried Nancy. "He'll be killed!" The pilot swerved the plane barely in time to avoid disaster. It lifted from the ground and rose sharply so as to miss by a fraction of an inch the pine trees that fringed the field. "Whew!" Randy ejaculated. "What a narrow escape!" "Narrow for us and narrow for Tom Stripe," Nancy declared, peering down at that scheming fellow on the ground from the cabin window. "I suspected he was party to a move to steal my land, and now I have definite proof of it." "Do you suppose he's connected with the Yellow Dawn Mining Company?" George inquired thoughtfully. "The company is in very poor repute up here in Canada," Randy said. "It buys worthless land, issues stock upon it, and sells the valueless shares to innocent buyers in the United States." "I'd expect Tom Stripe to be involved in a scheme like that," Nancy returned. She was eager to get to a telegraph office with the least possible delay, for she intended to wire her father in River Heights and tell him exactly what had happened. She felt certain that by getting in touch with the Velvet Company, he would be able to establish her claim to the property. Nancy thought with a tug at her heartstrings of the old hollow oak near the Pure Shop cabin. She had expected Norman Randy to take her there the following day. Now that would be impossible. "But I'll come back here inside of a week," she made up her mind. "Then I'll have a look at that famous old tree. Who knows, perhaps I'll learn its secret." At Wellington Lake, the party paused long enough for Nancy to communicate with Mrs. Donnelly and dispatch a wire to her father. "I'll send word to Annette," Randy decided, "and will tell her that as soon as I can possibly reach Wyndham, I'll be at her bedside." "Wire her by all means," Nancy urged. "Otherwise, your sudden appearance might be too much of a shock for her to bear." "I can't get to her quickly enough. If she in the meantime should take a turn for the worse, I should never forgive myself for having hesitated." "Well, I'll go there in the plane," Nancy offered. "Be ready in half an hour." Yeah, these girls, they're just getting chauffeured in a plane for free. While the girls were busily occupied at Mrs. Donnelly's boarding house, Randy slipped away to a barber shop. At the appointed time, he stood waiting for them at the landing field, but at first glance they failed to recognize him. "Why, you've shaved off your beard," Bess gasped. "You look years younger," George added admiringly. During the plane ride from Wellington Lake to Wyndham, the girls could not refrain from stealing sly glances at Norman. They had never suspected that he was so striking in appearance. Unaware that he was the object of so much admiration, Randy scarcely spoke during the flight, but sat gazing moodily out of the window. The craft soon landed at a small commercial field near Wyndham, and the party continued to the Good Hope Hospital by automobile. The prospector grew increasingly nervous as they came within view of the institution. "If anything has happened to Annette," he murmured, "I'll not be able to bear it." Good news awaited the party on their arrival, however. Upon inquiry at the hospital, Nancy was informed that the authoress had been improving steadily ever since her operation. "May I see her?" Brandy inquired eagerly. The wire dispatch from Wellington Lake had prepared the novelist for the visit of her former sweetheart. Her first feeling of excitement had subsided somewhat, but she was flushed and eager when he entered the room. "Norman!" she exclaimed joyfully. "Annette!" her lover cried, crossing toward her. "Can you ever forgive me?" Nancy and her chums, who had waited in the corridor, were convinced that the reunion was to be a happy one. A few minutes later, Annette and Norman insisted that the girls enter. "I owe everything to you," the writer declared gratefully to Nancy. "As long as I live, I'll never be able to thank you enough." Everyone chatted excitedly for a few minutes when a nurse presently came to warn the visitors that they must not stay too long. When out in the corridor again, Brandy said soberly to Nancy, "Annette and I know now that our separation was the result of an unfortunate circumstance. In some mysterious way, the note she left for me in the hollow oak was exchanged for another. I'd give anything to learn who played that cruel trick on us." "Perhaps we'll find out yet," Nancy told him. Returning to the downstairs lobby, an attendant handed the girl a telegram which had just been delivered. "I'm sure it's from Father," Nancy explained, tearing open the envelope. "I asked him to wire me in the care of the hospital." She read the lengthy message, the expression on her face denoting that its contents pleased her. "Father's coming here by plane," she announced. "He's as furious as I am about this scheme to steal my land." "And he's making a special trip here to help you?" Bess asked. Not entirely. He also intends to look up some data on the Taylor lawsuit case while he's up north, so the trip will therefore serve two purposes. One of Norman Ranney's first missions during his stay in Wyndham was to visit his parents. Nancy and her chums agreed that after picking up Mr. Drew at the airfield, they should join the prospector at his homestead. The young people did not have long to wait, however, for the attorney had chartered a plane very shortly after his wire had been dispatched. Nancy ran over to greet him when he stepped from the cabin. "Oh, Father, I'm so glad you're here," she cried. "I think it will require all your legal skill to save my property for me." "That's quite likely," Mr. Drew returned soberly. "Since I wired you, I've acquired some additional information." "You mean bad news?" "I'm afraid so, Nancy. Look at this message I received just as I took off from River Heights." He produced a telegram from the Velvet Company for her to read. "Cannot understand your communication," it said. Nancy Drew assigned all rights in radio contest property to Yellow Dawn Mining Company for small consideration. Nancy's eyes flashed angrily as she returned the missive to her father. "It's an outrage! I've never assigned any rights to any company." "You haven't signed your name to any papers?" Carson Drew inquired anxiously. "I've signed nothing." "Then either your signature has been forged or else the Velvet Company is involved in this scheme to defraud you of your property." "I've never heard of such high-handed robbery." "They haven't stolen the land yet," the lawyer told her grimly. "I know we're up against a clever group of schemers, but I think we shall be able to find a way to outwit them." "I met one of the ringleaders," Nancy said. "I heard him called Buck Sawtice." Carson Drew nodded. "He's the president of the so-called Yellow Dawn Company. In reality, he's the entire company, for the rest of the men do his bidding. Tom Stripe is one of his accomplices." "I knew that because he followed me to Wellington Lake and tried to prevent me from returning here." Carson Drew's face darkened. "I was afraid he might make trouble for you. That was one reason why I dropped everything and flew here to meet you." "I'm glad you came," Nancy declared, putting her arms around him, "though I doubt even Tom Stripe would dare to attempt any violence." "One can't be too sure, Nancy." During the ride to the Ranney farmhouse, Mr. Drew listened to his daughter's account of everything that had taken place in Canada. When they heard the automobile drive up the lane, Mr. and Mrs. Ranney pushed out to greet Nancy and showered their thanks upon her for bringing their son back home again. "We were so worried after you took his picture with you," Mrs. Ranney said, smiling. "We realize how foolish we were. Norman has told us of your wonderful kindness to him." Nancy and her friends were escorted into the house. After the first pleasantries had been exchanged, the conversation turned to more serious subjects, in which Carson Drew chanced to mention Buck Sawtice of the Yellow Dawn Mining Company. A strange expression came into Mrs. Ranney's eyes. "Buck Sawtice," she repeated. "Yes. Do you know of him?" the attorney probed. "He cost us our entire life savings," Mr. Ranney said gruffly. "He and another man talked us into buying some worthless mining stock." "We lost everything," his wife added. "We were forced to leave our Canadian home and come here. Now we work from morning until night, barely making enough to live on." "I wish I had known about it," Norman said contritely. "I would have shared anything in my possession with you." "It wasn't your fault," his mother smiled fondly. "We couldn't tell you about our troubles, for we didn't know how to get in touch with you." Carson Drew asked if he might see one of the shares of mining stock, and the owner obligingly found a certificate for him. "May I keep it for a few days?" the attorney requested. "It should be of help to me in my case against these men." "Keep it as long as you like," the farmer said. "It's of no use to us. I can't understand why we've saved it for all these years." A few minutes later, Nancy and her friends took their departure. Norman Ranney accompanied his newly made friends to the waiting automobile and addressed the Drew girl. "Will you be returning to Canada?" he asked. "I'm not certain yet, though I believe that is the plan. Are you going back with us?" "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. As soon as Annette can be moved from the hospital, she's to be brought here." "Oh, I'm so glad," Nancy interrupted. "I know she'll improve rapidly under your mother's care." "I feel sure she will, but she is worrying about something else. She told me today that she is greatly worried about grandfather Pierre. I promised her I would return to Canada and search for him." "I thought they're in Canada." "What?" Then of course you'll go back with us. Carson Drew, who had overheard the conversation, now walked over to where they were standing. I think everyone is eager to reach Wellington Lake with the least possible delay. I believe we should fly there tonight. There's no time to lose. That was the end of chapter 12. Okay. I swear they were in Canada. Okay, Joni. Well, thank you for being here. I hope you have a good rest of your day. That's so weird. Yeah, I swear they were already in Canada. Oh, hey, we can look at this together. Her Interactive sent the email 8 minutes ago. Let's look at it just a second. I'll pull up my email. This will give me a voice break for a second. This could be very exciting. This is good. They're giving us more information, right? Because I knew they would. Like, that's why I was annoyed with everybody. Like, freaking out about no information on mid, because they're gonna give it to us when they have it. Like, calm down, people. Okay. Let's look at this together. Yeah, whatever. This is fine. I'm assuming you guys can see it. So, where's the new stuff? This is where it opened. Where'd it go? Are you kidding me? Character bios. Okay, here we go. Here it is. Judge Danforth. He kind of looks like Tommy Lee Jones and somebody else. I don't know who else, but okay. Let's read it. The well-established yet somewhat scatterbrained Judge Danforth is at the center of pressing legal battles in the town of Salem. The arson of the famed historic Hathorne Estate is under investigation and citizens want justice. But could Judge Danforth be harboring a hidden agenda to disrupt the investigation? Okay, well, I forgot about the rest of them. Deirdre. She's adorable, oh my gosh. Her name is Tegan. Yeah, let's just go ahead and look at the rest of them. What do you think, Heartless? I haven't looked at the other ones in a long time. So we have May Paris, who has spent her life pulled between two extremes due to her physical appearance, the near-crushing protective attention lavished on her by her parents, and the unjustified fear of the local townsfolk. I guess she's albino. And that's why I like her pants. Lauren Corey. Lauren Corey is a calm and slightly grouchy introvert with a bookworm streak. She loves to bake and is beloved in the local community for winning entries into cooking contests. Okay. Sounds like me. I like her. She looks cool. Deirdre is the high-maintenance Deirdre Shannon who has spent her life hovering in Nancy's shadow and lives with the knowledge that she is the girl who would have become Nancy Drew had circumstances turned out better for her. Nicole just went live. Tegan is easy to like. She's outgoing, cheerful, extremely fashionable, and professional. But when Tegan's stressed out, she has an incredibly short fuse before her temper ignites. Okay, but she's freaking adorable. Oh my gosh. Already love her. Excited to see what they do with her. And then Jenna Ravencraft. Constantly commanding the spotlight, Jenna runs a local paranormal tour company. It's well known locally that her tours are faked. Or are they? Full of rigged special effects designed to showcase spells and ghosts. And she's like plus-sized, so that's exciting. And I like her hair. She looks super cool. Yeah. Anyways, I haven't looked at that in a long time. We can turn this off now. So yeah, that's not like huge news, but it's something. At least, right? So they're all female except the judge and the Hardys. I like her jacket. Yeah, I do too. Yeah, which I'm more than okay with that. Although it'd be cool to have a female judge and have somebody else be a guy. Yeah. Well, looks like there are going to be lots of characters, and that could be really interesting, so I hope they're getting close. I'm still not sold that they'll release it this year, and if they do, it'll probably be in like fall. I bet it would be fall because it's like supposed to be Halloween-ish and creepy. It would make sense to release it in fall, but yeah. But if they don't, definitely next year, right? As long as they don't go the Mean Girls route, like in Whack, I'm happy. Yeah, because been there, done that. Honestly, it reminds me of Alibi and Ashes. Is that weird? Maybe it's the fire at the beginning. I'm sure the story will be different, though. Anyways, there's some exciting news from Her Interactive, so hopefully I'll finish streaming / playing all the games before mid comes out. I do still think I have my C command. It's been 3 years, 8 months, 13 days since C was released. So it'll have been a good 4 years before they release the next game, I think. Which is crazy when you think about their history. Okay, back to the story. I'll see how far I can get today. I don't like competing with other people in the fam. I don't like streaming at the same time as other people in the fam, but it is what it is. And this is my first stream this week, so it was not planned to go like that, but things came up, So, yeah, let's just get back into it. So, this is chapter... Am I reading the Roman numerals wrong? That was chapter 17. This is chapter 18. Yeah, I'm reading the Roman numerals wrong. Really? I got a notification that Nicole went live 6 minutes ago. That's what it says, but I don't know. Okay, chapter 18. The Search. Twitch. Carson Drew's plan was to institute legal proceedings against the Yellow Dawn Mining Company. During the plane ride to Wellington Lake that night, he confided to Nancy that he suspected Tom Stripe and Buck Sawtice of being indirectly involved in the Marcus Taylor lumber case. He intended investigating the matter thoroughly before returning to River Heights. "I never dreamed I'd get into so much trouble because I won the radio contest," Nancy remarked. "I thought the Velvet Company was an honest concern." "I think it is. Naturally, the executives know nothing about you, so when they received the forged paper, which was doubtless the work of the Yellow Dawn officials, they more than likely never once doubted its authenticity. That mistake may cost me my land. I shouldn't feel so bad about it if it were an ordinary piece of property, but now that it seems as if gold may be found there, I can't bear the thought of losing it." "Nancy, why are you being greedy?" "We'll fight for your rights to the bitter end," the attorney assured her. "I feel partly responsible for all the trouble. Had I recorded your deed immediately after you received it, your position would have been far more secure." "This certainly wasn't your fault, Father. We knew nothing about the ground. Had it turned out to be worthless, I should doubtless have refused to accept it from the Velvet Company. We're up against a clever, unscrupulous group of men, and it will require all our ingenuity to combat them," concluded Carson Drew soberly. Some minutes later, the plane made a skillful landing at Wellington Lake, not far from Mrs. Donnelly's boarding house. Although the hour was late, a light stream gleamed in the windows. "She'll be surprised to see us returning so soon," Nancy chuckled. The woman was locking up for the night when the little party arrived. Learning that Nancy's party had left Wyndham without having had their evening meal, she insisted upon preparing a light repast for them before they should retire. Over their cups of cocoa, Mrs. Donnelly listened to Nancy's account of the plot to deprive her of the property. "The Yellow Dawn... Oh wait, forgot about her voice. The Yellow Dawn Mining Company," the woman exclaimed, upon hearing the name. "Yes, have you ever heard of it?" Nancy queried eagerly. "Under most unpleasant circumstances. I once bought some mining stock from that concern. I should have known better, for I'm not easily taken in on business deals." "Was the stock sold to you by a man named Buck Sawtice?" Dr. Drew. Mr. Drew queried. "No! I'd never buy anything from that fellow." "What can you tell me about him?" the attorney asked quickly. "Oh, I know him only by reputation, Mr. Drew. However, he's a partner in a lumber company which I suspect of being dishonest." "I was hoping that I might uncover just such information," the lawyer returned, highly pleased. "I must run down the clue you have furnished me." "I'm sorry I can't tell you any of the details," Mrs. Donnelly said regretfully, "though I can refer you to a man who might give you invaluable aid." She wrote out the name of the local attorney and gave the paper to Carson Drew, who promised himself to call upon his contemporary at his earliest convenience. It was after midnight when the consultation ended. The lights were then turned out and everyone went to bed. At 7 o'clock the following morning, Nancy came downstairs to find that her father had arisen before she had. Mr. Drew went down to the village, Mrs. Donnelly told her, "but said he expected to be back here in time for breakfast." However, when an hour and a half had elapsed and still the attorney had not returned, Nancy grew troubled. "If he doesn't get here soon, it will ruin all our plans for the day," she declared. At that moment, Carson Drew was sighted coming up the path, walking briskly. His face wore an animated expression. "Good news, Father?" Nancy asked. "Yes. I have definite evidence that Sawtice is tied up in a scheme to rob Marcus Taylor of his lumber interests here in the north, he told her, sitting down to a hearty breakfast which Mrs. Donnelly had kept warm for him. I think I've gathered enough material this morning to win the case. Oh, I'm glad of that, Nancy said. If we could only recover my mining property, everything ought to turn out splendidly. I'll visit your land today if I can arrange it, and have a talk with Sawtice if he is working there, Carson Drew announced. Norman Ranney, who was sitting nearby, overheard the remark. The matter can be easily arranged, Mr. Drew. I know this country as well as any guide you might engage. I have a boat here at Wellington Lake, and will be only too glad to take you with me. It doesn't seem fair to put you to so much trouble. If you'll accept payment... I couldn't, Mr. Drew. Your daughter has done me a service I shall never be able to repay her. Besides, I'm eager to return to Mr. Chap's cabin on my own account. Then we'll accept your offer gratefully, Mr. Ranney. How soon can we start? In 15 minutes, if you like. I'll be ready, Mr. Drew promised. And so will we, Nancy added, speaking for her chums. Carson Drew looked slightly troubled. Nancy, I don't like to disappoint you, but... Father! One can't be sure how this little adventure will end, my dear. Buck Sawtice is a tough customer and may make plenty of trouble. All the more reason why we should be along. Mr. Drew smiled. I can't imagine what the Marvins and Fanes would do to me if any harm should befall their daughters. We've already met Buck Sawtice and have escaped unscathed, George reminded him with a grin. I vote that you take us all along. With 3 against him, the attorney decided to give in. All right, but mind, if there's any trouble, you 3 young ladies can expect to be sent straight back to Mrs. Donnelly's. Nancy and her chums hurried to their rooms to don more suitable clothing than those they had on. By the time Norman Ranney had the boat and camping equipment ready, the group was waiting for him at the pier. The prospector chose a route similar to the one Pete Atkins had previously taken. The party rowed across Wellington Lake, made the portage, and then struck out again along the shore of Stewart Lake. Mr. Drew and Norman Ranney took turns at rowing. Since time was precious, a lunch Mrs. Donnelly had packed was eaten en route. We've made good time, the prospector declared after a time, squinting up at the sun. That's the Chat cabin over yonder. Far across the lake, the girls caught a glimpse of the log structure. Nancy was quick to observe that no smoke was curling from the chimney. I hope we find Mr. Chap this time, she said, looking troubled. You don't suppose he has met with an accident, do you? He's probably somewhere in the vicinity, Dr. Drew. Mr. Drew returned. It isn't like Mr. Chap to be away for days at a time, Norman Ranney commented. I'm beginning to feel worried about him. With the goal so near, the prospector bent to his oars with a will. 10 minutes later, the boat grated upon the sandy beach. While the guide and Mr. Drew dragged the craft from the water, Nancy, George, and Bess ran on ahead to find out if Mr. Chap were at home. As the former emerged into the clearing, she halted abruptly. The cabin had been boarded up. Well, of all things, she exclaimed in astonishment. What in the world does this mean? Bess and George were equally bewildered. They ran back to the beach to tell the men the disappointing news, and the 2 at once came to view the building for themselves. I can't understand it, the prospector said, gloomily examining the covered windows and door. It looks as if Grandfather Chap may have returned here yesterday and closed up the place himself. As far as I know, he expected to remain here for the summer. His crops are planted, Nancy observed, and the cupboards inside the house are filled with perishable groceries. I don't like the appearance of things, Ranney confessed. Do you think he has met with foul play? Nancy asked quickly. I don't know what to think. Tom Stripe and Raymond Niles acted suspicious, to say the least. They tied me up and left me alone to die. If Grandfather Chap happened to have been in their way, they doubtless would have treated him the same way. Would it be possible to break into the house and make certain that he isn't a prisoner inside? Nancy asked. I think I can pry off one of the boards over the rear window, Ranney decided, making an inspection. After considerable trouble, the prospector succeeded in removing the barrier. While Nancy and her companions waited outside, he climbed through the window and disappeared within. Shortly thereafter, he returned. Everything is just exactly as we left it, he reported. Mr. Chap isn't there. He carefully boarded up the window again. I suppose there's nothing to do but to continue on our journey, Nancy said in disappointment. It begins to look as if the elderly man really has left the place for good. Gloomily, the party returned to the beach. While Nancy and her chums took care of the oars and light equipment, Carson Drew and Norman Rainey carried the boat a short distance to the rushing stream, which offered rapid transportation deeper into the woods. After an uneventful and somewhat silent journey, the craft was finally drawn up near the Dawson cabin. "How's Pete?" Nancy questioned anxiously after she had greeted its mistress. "Greatly improved," the woman assured her. "This morning he ate a hearty meal and walked about for a few minutes. Of course he's still very weak." "That's only natural after his receiving such a hard blow," Nancy smiled. "Where is he now? I should like to have him meet my father." "He and Jake went out to the barn a few minutes ago. I'll call them." There was no need for her to do so, however. As she went over to the door, Mrs. Dawson saw her older son hurrying toward the house. "I tried to stop him, but I couldn't," he exclaimed when he was within earshot. "There's no telling what he may do." "Jake, what are you talking about?" his mother demanded. "Pete Atkins," the boy explained. "He said he's going to run down Tom Stripe and square things up." End of chapter 18. Very dramatic there. She's streaming spoops. Okay. I may have to go get some water. So, I'm going to take a quick break, leave you with some music, and I'm going to go get some water. So I'll be right back. I have returned. I'm not sure how much longer I'll go. Let me see here. How many pages did I say? 218, I think. Maybe I'll go another chapter. Depending on how long. We're on 19. I'll go 1 or 2 more chapters. Although the next chapter that's kind of long. And then we will finish the book off next week. So, chapter 19, Mr. Drew's Strategy. It was too late to overtake the guide. Bent upon redressing the wrong which had been done him by Tom Stripe, Pete Atkins had slipped away into the dense woods, all the while avoiding the well-worn trails. What a pity he didn't wait, Mr. Drew said regretfully. Soon the authorities will be here. This was news to the others, since the attorney had neglected to mention the fact that he had called upon the sheriff that morning while in Wellington Lake. There he had received the assurance that men would be sent immediately to protect Nancy's property. An expert surveyor will come along too, Mr. Drew told his daughter. After he's gone over the land, we'll know exactly where we stand. Until we are absolutely certain that the property is the same as that deeded to you by the Velvet Company, we shall have to move slowly. How many men will the sheriff bring along with him? Norman Rainey inquired. Not very many, I'm afraid. It would be a good idea if he could round... Man, I can't read today. Maybe I should just do one more chapter. Not very many, I'm afraid. It would be a good idea if we could round up some others. Buck Sawtice and his men are likely to offer up armed resistance. I think we could find a number of woodsmen who might be willing to join the posse. The posse, the prospector said slowly. There's an accent over the E. I'll be glad to go, Mr. Dawson spoke up. And both of my sons are mighty handy when it comes to protecting property. We hope there will be no necessity for a fight, Mr. Drew returned, though we shall have to be prepared for it. Norman Rainey knew of several families living in the immediate vicinity. While he rode in one direction to spread word of the gathering posse, Nancy and George with young Jake went the opposite way to ask for similar help. They returned to the Dawson cabin with several neighbors riding behind them. I feel like a modern Joan of Arc leading her warriors to battle, Nancy confessed with a smile to George as they dismounted. I shouldn't want to miss this adventure for anything in the world. The girls discovered that during their absence, the Wellington Lake Sheriff and his deputies had arrived. The yard swarmed with horsemen. A few minutes later, Norman Rainey returned with additional numbers. As the group waited for orders to start off, Mr. Drew crossed over to the place where the girls were standing with Mrs. Dawson. Nancy surmised what his purpose was at once. Now, Father, don't tell us we can't go, she forestalled him. With all these men along to protect us, you surely can't say it won't be safe. That's just what I did intend to say, you young tease. We'll be very careful if you'll only permit us to go along. The trip will be a hazardous one at best, Nancy. I'll not be able to keep an eye on all of you. If there only could be some way whereby we might keep in close communication with one another, even though separated. I know of a way, Nancy cried, her eyes lighting up with inspiration. How? Mr. Drew smiled. Why, the old hollow oak tree. I don't understand. You couldn't, because I've never told you about it. It happens that on the Chap property there stands an old hollow oak tree which would be an ideal place in which to leave a message. I propose that should any one of us get into trouble, that person will endeavor to drop a note in this famous tree. It was obvious, however, that Carson Drew was not particularly impressed with this idea. I've never even seen this tree, he protested. We can have Mr. Rainey pointed out so that everyone will be certain of its location, Nancy went on, growing more enthusiastic as she spoke. He told me only a few minutes ago that we would pass close to it on our way to visit my property. Mr. Drew conceded defeat. If I turn this idea down, I feel sure you'll think up another, he laughed. I still am convinced that it is unwise to take you with me, though I suppose I must give in. How can we leave any notes when we have neither paper nor pencil? Bess questioned doubtfully. Nancy ran to the house for the necessary articles, which she distributed among her friends. I know you think the plan won't work, she told her father a little later as he assisted her into the saddle, but you never can tell. Perhaps it isn't as wild a scheme as I thought at first, Nancy. At least I'll reserve judgment until after I've seen this mysterious old oak. The posse set off through the timber, and slowly began the steep, rocky ascent. Nancy, her father, and her chums were mounted on spirited horses. Gradually they forged ahead until they eventually found themselves leading the cavalcade. Then presently the Drew girl moved ahead of the party eagerly. As she rounded a bend in the trail, she suddenly halted her horse, for through the trees she had caught a glimpse of a dark object lying prone upon the ground. She was almost certain it was a man. Her first thought had been that Buck Sawtis. I don't know if it's Sawtis, Sawtis, I don't know. Either way, I hate it. I hate that name. And some of his confederates were watching the trail. I must be careful not to lead the party into a trap, she reasoned to herself. Waiting motionless, she watched the figure in the bushes. It did not move. What do you see? Called her father. Convinced that her fears were groundless, Nancy sprang from the saddle before answering. Tossing the reins over a small bush, she pushed aside the foliage. There she came upon Pete Atkins, who was lying face downward on the ground. Pete! She cried fearfully. The guide made no response as the girl attempted to turn him over. Then she noticed that his shirt was saturated with blood. Alarmed, Nancy ran back, calling for help. Come quickly, father, she cried. Pete Atkins has been wounded. All the riders urged their horses on to a faster pace. Upon reaching the bend in the trail, they hastily dismounted. Careful, men, the sheriff warned them. This may be a trick. On the alert for any trouble, the men followed Nancy to the place where Pete Atkins lay. Pete's been shot. Comb the woods and see if you can find the person who did it, the sheriff ordered, bending down to examine the guide. He had brought along a first aid kit, and after probing about for the bullet, bandaged the wounded shoulder. As the officer worked, the guide opened his eyes and groaned with pain. Who did it, Pete? The sheriff asked gently. The man was too exhausted to answer him. It must have been an unprovoked attack, Norman Rainey announced furiously. I imagine Pete was shot from behind. The members of the posse were returning from their unsuccessful search of the surrounding woods. Not a living soul had been sighted. Will Pete live? Nancy asked the sheriff anxiously, as they got out of hearing of the wounded man. Yes, I think his chances are very good, she was told, but he's so weak from loss of blood that we won't be able to take him with us. Why can't you assign one of the men to remain with him? That's probably the best thing to do, the sheriff agreed. One of the men from Wellington Lake was selected for that duty. After Pete had been carefully moved to a more comfortable place and laid upon an improvised bed of blankets, the party prepared to proceed onward again. It was apparent to everyone that an entirely new feeling had come over the men. At first, they had regarded the expedition as more or less of an adventure. Now, infuriated at the heartless treatment Pete had received, they were eager to avenge themselves upon his assailant. Their faces were grim and determined. I don't like the look of things, Carson Drew said anxiously as he assisted Nancy to mount. I fear that this shooting forebodes trouble. I only wish that you and your chums were back safe with Mrs. Dawson. We'll be careful, Nancy promised. Please don't worry about us. I can't help it, for all the responsibility rests on me. However, I've been thinking over that idea of yours, and if it will work, maybe you'll be all right. You mean the one about the oak tree? Yes. If anything should go wrong and we were to become separated, try to drop a message in the hollow trunk. I most certainly will, but I doubt if anything serious is going to happen. We have so many guards to protect us. I hope you're right, Nancy. As they continued along the trail, at a much swifter pace than before, the attorney rode close to the girls. At length, the posse arrived at the knoll from which Nancy had previously viewed her property. Here the riders halted for orders. Nancy, her father, and Norm and Randy all dismounted in order that the girl might obtain a more advantageous position from which to view the scene in the valley below. Several men were working feverishly near the cliff where Randy had discovered gold. "There's Buck Sawtice directing the removal of the ore," the prospector announced bitterly, training his powerful field glass upon one of the men. He handed it over to Nancy. "I take it that Sawtice will refuse to allow our man to survey the property," Carson Drew remarked, thinking aloud. "That's to be expected," the prospector agreed. "He'll not give up the land if he can help it." "No, but if we take the camp by surprise, the chance of their resisting will be much less." "We can descend from the knoll without being seen from below," Randy stated. "The tall bushes make a perfect screen." So saying, he indicated a trail Nancy had not seen during her previous visit. The two men returned to the sheriff to give their orders. Nancy was about to follow when a slight sound in the bushes attracted her attention. She saw a man crawling rapidly on his hands and knees through the foliage, and then scramble to his feet to race madly toward the camp below. "A lookout!" Nancy called in frantic warning. "Stop him before he gives an alarm!" I think that's a good place to stop. I don't know why, but today, I can't read. My voice is not doing well, and I just keep stumbling, and so, anyways, thank you all for coming. I can't even talk normally. Thank you to those who participated in chat. Thank you to those who were lurking. Thank you everybody for being here and supporting the stream. Hopefully we will finish this book next week. But also, big announcement, next week we are going to be celebrating V's birthday on Friday morning at 10 a.m. Central Time, 11 Eastern. And we're going to be playing Nancy Drew Fam Sims. So we will be continuing that. We'll start with making V because it's her birthday. Well, it'll be the day after her birthday, but we're going to be celebrating V's birthday. So that will be very exciting. I hope you all can come. And then I will announce the rest of my stream schedule probably on Sunday. I am planning on doing a stream tonight. I don't know what time though. People are stopping by my house. I don't know how long they're staying. Probably not that long because they'll have their kid with them and she goes to bed at like 8. So I would say maybe 9, 8:30, 9. I'll be playing Stardew Valley. So if you're interested in that, I hope you can join. And I think those are all my announcements. So be on the lookout for a announcement for my stream schedule for next week. And I will post that in the Discord and on Twitter. And if you don't follow me on Twitter, here's my social where you can keep up to date. So, Stardew! Yes, I love Stardew. I was playing a certain character for my streams, so I don't remember what she was working on, but we will get back to that. I know I only had a couple streams with that character, but we'll just pick up and try to figure out what her goals were. So yeah, I hope you can join me for that. And until then, have a good day, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.